if men can actually start to get in touch with their own archetypal feminine, it doesn't emasculate them whatsoever.
Continually hold your theology up to the light and regularly consider whether it represents this God of love.
I'm Rachel Cottam, and this is the Allies at Work podcast. Here, you'll discover bite-sized tactics that you can start using today to improve gender equity in your workplace, home, and community. In today's episode, you'll hear about the intersection of spirituality and allyship from an expert in Greek mythology and a former female pastor. Rayner Jae Liu is an executive coach at Spoken Word who is passionate about Eris and what she represents. Rayner emphasizes what male allies can learn about themselves by embracing both masculine and feminine archetypes. Amanda Reill is a former female pastor who ultimately left the tradition because of the inequities she experienced. Amanda invites women to unpack their own beliefs, rebuilding trust in themselves. And she invites men to be bold allies who call out injustice even in their own religious circles. Amanda and Rayner present very different approaches to allyship and spirituality, but both are so authentic and unique. I think you'll love hearing their stories. At the end of this episode, I'll share an allyship micro-action with you, something you can start doing right away. Today's allyship action: the mental gender swap. Let's dive in. Okay. This podcast is called Allies at Work. So why are we talking about religion? Across the globe, around 65% of the population participates in patriarchal religions with male figureheads or primary deities. While there are matriarchal faith systems or traditions with female figureheads, it's still rare to see gender equity in religion, even in our modern day. I grew up in a very religious culture with an extreme reverence for patriarchy. My career ambitions were limited by this traditional view of gender roles. I also live in Utah, the U.S. state that ranks worst for gender equality and whose culture is defined by its majority religion. Around 55% of Utah adults belong to the same church. This religion is patriarchal, with exclusively male prophets and priesthood leaders, and specific guidance around the roles of men and women. In America at large, we often hesitate to name patriarchy as a problem because of its ties to Christian beliefs and our national values. For some individuals, these inequities lead to a full rejection of spirituality. For others, religious doctrines can create a powerful foundation for exploring unique gender identities. This episode is not intended to elevate or discredit religion as part of your allyship journey. Instead, I hope to do what this podcast always hopes to do, which is let you hear other perspectives and get curious about your own beliefs. Spiritual traditions and gender allyship interact in really personal ways, and these values carry over into our workplaces and the way we treat each other. We can be better allies at work if we better understand our spirituality. To begin, we'll hear from Rayner Jae Liu, executive coach at Spoken Generation. Rayner excels at helping leaders become powerful, authentic, and whole. And one of the ways he does this is through the lens of astrology and mythology. Rayner often speaks about the Greek goddess Eris and what she represents for activism, identity, and peace. Here's a bit of his insight. So, talk to me about Eris. What does she represent in gender equality?
I'll start by saying I feel appreciative that you're asking me about this, and nobody in what I usually think about as the workplace asks me about this particular goddess so directly. So I'm feeling intrigued by the question. What does Eris represent in gender equality? The best way for me to explain it is this: is in a lot of Western philosophy, and this is not exclusive to Western philosophy, but I'm just using Western philosophy as the basis through which I try and explain the concept, especially in the Greek and Roman canon, right? A lot of us have read classics. We've read, or at least heard of, the Iliad, of Homer, the Aeneid, the Odyssey, right? So many millennia ago, the Greeks and the Romans were talking about there being certain gods and goddesses. In the history of Western philosophy, these gods and goddesses were sort of seen to represent aspects of the human person or the human psyche. So when we talk about a person or a goddess like Eris, part of what we're looking at is what some people call archetypes. And all that means is a pattern that we see in the world, right? And it's usually somewhat psychological in nature. It usually lies within us. Eris is interesting in that she's known as the goddess of strife and discord. So to a lot of people who don't know her, it sounds very scary, right? She's causing trouble, she's doing all these things, and there's a whole thing there that, there's a bit of a patriarchal projection often even using that description, because a lot of
Mm.
people will hear that and go, she's problematic, she's disrupting the peace. And a lot of her theology is about kind of saying, actually, the way that this system is set up right now is inherently inequitable, so I can't be in a good relationship with you. And so what I have to do is to use a little bit of discord or controversy to actually bring us back into harmony and alignment so that we can actually have the proper relationships that we really want, or we're really actually seen. One of the symbols that I really like to use for Eris is actually, and I love that in a way, even though I'm drawing from the Western canon, she has a lot of relationships to Eastern spirituality, so Buddhism and Taoism. And one of the symbols in Taoism is the yin yang, right? Where half of it sort of represents the yin, which is also known as the archetypal feminine, and the other half is the archetypal masculine. Historically, our civilization, not all of our civilization, but a lot of our civilization, particularly Western civilization, has been very imbalanced. We've really sort of at a subtle level, but also at a very pervasive level, really favored things that are sort of prototypically quote unquote masculine. And so these are things like logic, but at the expense of intuition. These are things like, I know what's best for you, instead of you checking in with yourself and thinking, what's really going on for me here? And so as a result, there has been this subjugation of the archetypal feminine in favor of the archetypal masculine, which has often translated to the marginalization or the subjugation of women in many places, including the workplace. So one of the things about Eris is if we sort of just look at a yin yang or a 50-50 type of thing, all Eris is doing in terms of her function is trying to restore gender parity between two poles. And a lot of times people walk in with an assumption that no, there is parity, when in fact, if you sense anger, a certain level of anger more often than not, the reason that's happening is because there's not actually parity there. But for us to really recognize that, we have to be able to sit with and unpack some of the projections, the biases, and the entrenched ways that we've been trained by our culture to behave in certain ways that simply perpetuate a pattern that is fundamentally unjust. So that parity is about restoring a system toward justice and toward equity. And so Eris is this really interesting phenomenon that helps us to do that, or can help us to do that, if that's the route through which we want to try and understand justice, inclusion, allyship, things like that.
I love that. I think that is so interesting how you're able to kind of take this blend of Eastern and Western philosophy and religion and present this case for gender equity. I just think that's so powerful. I do want to make sure that we maybe address the tactical advice that we can pull from that from male allies. So maybe as you're thinking about Eris, as you're thinking about that yin yang, as you're thinking about that drive towards justice and gender parity, what are some of the things that you think men can learn from these examples you've shared in spirituality to actually be better allies in their workplaces and communities?
I feel like a lot of the men in the room will have heard this one before, but it's never a bad starting point from my perspective. I think it's always helpful to, with any habit, with anything you want to do in your life, always start tiny, always start small, rather than feel like you have to, I don't know, change the whole system, Start small. And what I would say to many men, especially men who live in a Western context, but really any context, this happens in so-called Eastern countries as well, is to try and get in touch with one's feelings first. It doesn't mean that you have to express yourself effusively. That's not really what I'm saying. But what I'm sort of offering is, if you sort of sense that something is wrong in the room, see if you can be in touch with that. See if you can hang out with whatever's coming up for you. Because I think one of the first steps tactically that can happen in terms of gender allyship for men is, the ideal case is they're able to see something in the room and sort of step in and say, hey, I think the way that this person is being treated is inequitable or not right, or, I'm noticing that we're doing this, and calling something out. But before actually being able to do that, sometimes even just noticing what you're feeling internally. Am I feeling uncomfortable? I'm actually kind of feeling angry that this person's being treated this way. Every person might have a different starting point in terms of what they feel. But I think with a lot of men that at least I've spoken to and that I know, so many men are discouraged to, they're trained to think that feeling is the enemy, that feeling is bad, right? And so what I would say tactically is if many men can actually start to get in touch with their own sort of archetypal feminine, it doesn't emasculate them whatsoever. It actually helps them feel and even come across as more whole people. It allows the rest of their masculinity to actually come through more powerfully. So a man who's actually in touch with all of his emotion becomes someone who is really ready to step in the moments where maybe his influence or his ability to be of service or help or support is it's going to be helpful. Yeah.
Uh-huh. I think that's incredibly
Yeah.
powerful. And actually, one of the things you said that I think is really powerful for even folks like me, for white women, is that permission to feel an emotion, even the emotion of anger. I think so often for white women, we kind of
Yeah.
fall into this people-pleasing category where we feel like we can be allies for other people as long as we're doing it in a nice way, as long as we're being kind and courteous. But what I've learned, there's actually a book called White Women by Syra Rao and Regina, which is these
Yeah.
women of color who are trying to like educate on how we can do
Yeah.
better. And one thing I love is they come from their anger. Like they use their anger as kind of the tone for the entire book. And it was so helpful for me to, like you said, sit in that discomfort and say, where is the injustice in this? Where is the anger actually justified? And what can I learn about myself and my own privilege through that experience?
Right, right. One of the things that comes up for me around anger is anger as an emotion typically comes up when a boundary is violated or when a person's wholeness is violated in some way. So sometimes that is your wholeness violated. That sometimes you feel angry because you recognize that that's happening to somebody else, and you recognize that I'm not actually that disconnected from this person. Of course, I'm going to feel angry on this person's behalf. So, I think anger is a really helpful it's a helpful emotion because it shows us that there's a boundary somewhere that has not been properly held or respected. And so what do we need to do to, again, back to this Eris idea, to shift that boundary to get back to parity? One of the things I often talk about, and you also talked about white women, which I think is really interesting because it kind of relates to this from a psychological perspective or philosophical perspective. I often like to talk about the difference between Eris and Venus. The quick surface level analysis here is that a lot of what you said about like many in your case you were saying like white women and how the appeasement, the diplomacy, the making sure everything is harmonious, right? Like
Mhm.
let's not rock the boat as much as we can. My sense is that a lot of women, they know the Venus archetype well. It is one of the, you could call it a feminine archetype in some cases. And what's very different about Eris, though, is Venus is like never angry. I often make the comparison where Venus and Eris are like, if you've seen the musical Wicked, Venus is like Linda the Good Witch, who's like, hey, I'm gonna be popular. I know what to say. I'm never gonna rock the boat. And Eris is gonna be the one who's coming in angry, like Syra and the other author of that book
Wow.
probably were, right? Where they say, no, this thing is fundamentally unjust. And what I believe is that we need both of them, but we can't do the job of gender allyship without some of the anger that usually comes with the Eris archetype.
Oh, I'm so glad you made that distinction. I think that's really powerful. And I think it's really helpful because the next question I wanted to ask was really from that Eris archetype and from that spirituality that you kind of preface this with is what women can do. Because yes, we're here for men. We want men to be better allies at work, but we also want women to be better allies for themselves and for each other. So I know we've already touched on this quite a bit, but is there anything else that you would add for women that we can kind of learn from the spiritual archetype that you've shared?
What I can tell you is, and it's not like I came up with these things. A lot of these things I learned from women. But one of the things that I have received, and I really need to watch it more in the field. So, this is tentative, but let's say you're in a meeting and there's only one person at first who's like, I think we should think beyond the bottom line. I think we should think about these other things. I believe there are studies out there showing that if even one other person says, yeah, I agree with her, then that whole system has a way higher probability of actually changing and transforming. So I would say for the women in the audience, and again, I want to be conscious here because I haven't really tested this out. I also don't have the experience of being a woman or living a woman's life. But what I have heard so far from women who I greatly respect is, what does it look like to have a sister next to me? A sister on my left and a sister on my right. How does that start to shift some of the dynamic? From the, I guess, spirituality perspective or archetypal perspective, what I try and remember when I feel enraged, when I see things go on, is to try and remind myself that actually I'm no better or worse than anyone else. So if I am experiencing marginalization, I'm not better than somebody else. I don't get to play status games through victimhood, but I'm certainly not worse than anyone else. And that also means that despite experiencing marginalization, even though I may not have all the courage right now to speak up, even though I may not have all the tools or the practice to pull it off in the way that I really want to, if I am anchored in the knowledge that I am no better, inherently better, and no inherently worse than anybody else, if I start with myself, if I have an equity mindset within myself, it can often give me the ability to speak up and dare to speak up to actually shift the balance sort of externally. If we can start with an equity mindset internally, it becomes a lot easier to advance and manifest an equity mindset externally. So no projections, no making yourself too big or too small, but having yourself be almost like metaphysical Goldilocks, you know? No, I belong here. Like I have a voice. Like I'm not here to dominate you. I'm just here to push things back again to this point of equity. That's all I'm here to do. And I think when you love yourself, when you know your inherent value, even as the world is trying to project onto you and say, no, you're not valuable, no, you're less than, you're whatever, it becomes a lot easier to stand in the face of a lot of the projections and the resistance that a lot of women, and I think a lot of people who experience different forms of marginalization get, and give others an experience where there's something other than the status quo that they've been very used to. And it might take time, but it starts to give that person a little bit in their encoding to start thinking about, oh, wow, she responded like that in this situation. I wasn't expecting that. So I think that's what I have, is start with an equity mindset, not just externally. We want to see equity externally, but what does it mean to see yourself as a true equal, even before the world is ready for that mindset?
Rayner's invitation to us is to embrace balance and serendipity. Men, women, everyone, we need each other. We can find fullness in our lives and in our allyship when we don't limit ourselves to preconceived notions of gender. Our next guest is Amanda Reill. Today, Amanda is an author, ghostwriter, speaker, and ICF certified coach whose work has been published in Harvard Business Review and other outlets. But prior to her career in writing, Amanda spent about 14 years as a pastor in a Christian tradition that celebrated women in leadership. Unfortunately, Amanda's experience took a turn for the worst. In the following segment, you will hear Amanda recount her experience of sexual abuse in her faith tradition. While Amanda does not share explicit details, if you would like to skip to the allyship action at the end, that segment starts at the 29-minute mark. One of the theological concepts you'll hear Amanda refer to is original sin, the idea that since Eve partook of the fruit first, committing the first or original sin, women are inherently sinful, and we can't trust ourselves. In some traditions, original sin transcends gender, saying that all human beings are corrupted through Adam and Eve's fall from God and from grace. Amanda's story offers a powerful examination of widely held theological beliefs and challenges us to be better stewards of the women in our religious organizations, fostering safe, inclusive, and trusting spaces. Here's her story.
So my experience is a little unique in that I spent about 14 years as a pastor in a Christian tradition where female pastors were celebrated, where they were very affirming to the idea of women in leadership. But it was actually while I was serving in that role that I ended up in a situation where I was sexually abused by the lead pastor in our church for about 2 years. And as I've spent time unraveling that experience after the fact, one of the things I've realized is just how much our theology about who we are as people actually contributed to the situation that I found myself in. I realized that I spent years believing that at our core, we're bad. We're ultimately sinful, and that left to our own devices, what we naturally want is only to serve ourselves. We have to continually die to ourselves, right? And so when that came to any amount of trusting one's intuition, trusting one's body, when you receive those signals that like, hey, this is not safe, this is not okay, and you have a person who's in a position of authority telling you that submission is necessary and who's interpreting scripture for you, et cetera, which is where most of us are in our church situations, where ultimately on some level we're trusting these people who are in positions of authority. And that was certainly the case for me. This person was a father figure to me. And even though I was a strong woman with this strong personality, I was still very vulnerable to what this person was telling me. And so now on this side of time, as I'm developing my theology, I'm examining the fruit of some of these things that we believe. And so the fruit of this belief that I could not trust myself and that at my core I am sinful was that I did not feel able to listen to any of my natural warning signals and trust my body and my instincts. So that line of thinking was very damaging to me, and I think that it's been very damaging to other people as well. And the advice that I would have to both men and women would be to continually hold your theology up to the light, so to speak, and regularly consider whether it represents this God of love that you say that you're committed to. For many people, and I know this was true of myself, we are so focused on getting other people saved and helping other people, and under good intention, like wanting to share the hope that we have, et cetera, that we actually don't take any time to ask questions and to listen to the journey of others. And this is someone who believed wholeheartedly that this authority in my life was something that I could trust, that this faith system was something that I could trust, that this person was somebody that I could trust, and someone who had my best interests in mind. And when it comes to allyship, I think it's important for men to recognize that women, especially women in the church, don't necessarily understand the dynamics of abuse. I didn't know what was happening to me when it happened. I would not have used the word abuse. I didn't understand what had happened. I knew that I was very hurt and that it was not okay, but I certainly didn't understand these concepts of grooming and things like that. It wasn't until the situation was over. It was actually my husband who had spent 10 years in elementary education watching videos about abuse of children and grooming processes that when I told him my story, he immediately recognized what had happened. And so I think these are things that we all need to be educating ourselves about and understanding that abuse is different. I had people in my situation tell me to go to my abuser and talk to him privately. And in an abuse situation, when you understand the dynamics, you would never, ever advise somebody to do that, but that seemed like it made sense to that person in that dynamic. And it's just because people don't understand. And so I think if men can have that understanding of abuse, then they can have their eyes open for when they see things that are suspicious, and they have the opportunity to question things in a very public way in the church or find ways to advocate for women that they see who are voluntarily sort of submitting themselves in ways that actually rob the church of their true gifts and wisdom because they're trying to be humble or whatever. So I don't think that anyone realizes where this path can lead. And it's not a matter of, oh, this person left the church because they had a bad experience or, there's another abuse situation and that's sad, but they should just come back to the church. I think it's a bigger reality than that. And we need to realize that that person left the church because they realized that it was time to take some time to evaluate other perspectives about what it means to be a person of God.
As Amanda and I talked about our own faith deconstructions, we came back to this principle of fruit, though not the fruit that Eve ate in the garden. We talked about how you can often recognize a true ally by the fruit of their works or their actions. I want to share just a little bit of this discussion that we had because I think it's meaningful as we grow into more intersectional allyship. Women aren't the only folks who are often devalued by religion. Here's a little bit more on that.
My general stance on faith and my spiritual journey right now in general is, I say I'm in like a place of listening right now, because when you're responsible for getting people saved, that's like all you can think about is how to get somebody to where you are constantly. And you're never like, there's just no like, oh, that's a good point. Like there's no room for that, at least in the tradition that I was part of. And so I'm doing that now. And the best way that I can describe sort of how I make decisions in terms of what am I going to keep and what am I going to throw away has to do with fruit, like what is the fruit? Like, again, carrying something to its end. Like one of the biggest issues for me, and totally understand and respect if you have a different perspective on this, but right after everything was sort of like, okay, like evaluate it all, I looked at gender and sexuality and I said, the fruit of this idea that God does not want people to be homosexual is that thousands of young people who aren't even adults yet take their own lives. That's a fruit, because they think that God's not okay with them or there's something wrong with them. So they don't even get a chance to even be a grown up to make that decision, to figure all of that out. They're still a kid. And so if that's our theological perspective and that's what we're teaching and that's the result of it, I'm like, nope, the fruit of that is clearly death, quite literally. So I don't claim to know all the answers, but if I'm going to have to take a side in what I feel is a tricky situation, and I've been on the other side of it for most of my life, I'm going to come down on the side that favors life. And I'm going to put my bet in that camp, and I'll deal with God if I'm wrong about it. But I would rather bet on life, in my opinion. So that's the filter that I use now for determining what is of God. How do we be of God? So
I love that. And it's very relatable. I think, honestly, that's something my grandpa used to say to me all the time is look at the fruit. When you're evaluating people, when you're evaluating faith, businesses, whatever, look at the fruit. And if it's good, then put your trust in it. But no, I mean, Utah is the worst. I think it might be the worst in the US for LGBTQ youth suicide.
Oh, really? Wow.
And to me, that's just it is so clearly unacceptable that we need to do better in our theology, in our culture, in our schools to send a different message, to send, like you said, a message of life and love and acceptance. I'm incredibly grateful to Amanda for choosing to share this personal and painful story with us. Unfortunately, her story is not unique. A simple Google search will show you how common abuse can be within religion. But as I stated at the beginning of the episode, our goal here is not to condemn or to preach. Our goal is to get curious, to listen, to believe women, and to do better. In contrast to the concept of original sin is the Christian belief that all human beings are children of God, or the Sikh belief that all are equal within the Gurdwara or the community, the Stoic concept that wherever there is a human being, there is an opportunity for kindness, the Baha'i teaching that says if all humans have been created in the image of God, then God does not make any distinction between people, or even the quote from renowned physicist Neil deGrasse Tyson, who said, "We are biologically connected to every other living thing in this world. We are not figuratively, but literally stardust. We are stardust brought to life, then empowered by the universe to figure itself out." Whatever language you use to describe it, archetype, doctrine, astrology, religion, citizenship, science, if we can learn to see everyone as equal, we will be better allies. We will have a better world. At the end of each episode, I share an allyship micro action, something you could start doing right away. Today's allyship action is the mental gender swap. This tactic is a mental exercise where you swap genders in your mind after passing judgment on a woman. Ask yourself, would this same criticism apply to a man, or vice versa? Would her assertiveness be annoying if she were a man? Would you call his display of emotion embarrassing or inappropriate if he were a woman? Why is it sweet when a man leaves early for a dance recital, but it's not taking her job seriously when a woman leaves early for parent-teacher conference? Would you be concerned about promoting a parent of young children if he was a father and not a mother? When the swapped result feels funny, interrogate that idea. There's likely some bias at play. You can be a better ally in the workplace when you check your own thinking and make changes accordingly. This same mental exercise works for older employees, people with disabilities, Black leaders, and other underestimated groups. And if you're looking to try out this tactic in long form, rewatch the Barbie movie or read The Power by Naomi Alderman. These mental gender swaps often feel funny to anyone who lives in a patriarchal society. That's how unconscious bias works. You're not aware of it until you challenge it. Next time.
I'm a woman of color. I know what it is to feel like I have to work harder, to feel like my work is being adequately judged.
Really take the time to listen to the experiences and perspectives of women without interrupting or dismissing their concerns.
Learn more, do better.